To start off with, let's give you a random fact about me. I am 23 years old, 24 by the end of December. That will be relevant to the video at some point. Now, the First World War is arguably the worst war in human history, and I know that's a loaded statement. Yet for the soldiers fighting, they suffered the brutal clash of 19th century warfare and modern technology. They would fight a war suffering not only from stagnant fighting, but stagnant disease-ridden mud as well. It wasn't all doom and gloom, however. In fact, at the start of the war, many believed it would be over by Christmas. When that didn't happen, something else happened instead. But before we get into it, it's everybody's favourite part of the video, where I ask strangers on the internet to support my channel. Please. The first way you can support me is by becoming a patron on Patreon. There you get lots of goodies like sneak peeks, videos 48 hours early. The other way to support me is through my merch store and get my beautiful moustache plastered all over you. And if I make one more weird sexual joke about my moustache, I might as well just make an OnlyFans for my moustache. Lastly, as you do know, because I talk about it a lot, I have a self-published book that you can check out on Amazon. And if none of that floats your boat, just like, subscribe, and tap that bell button for me so that you get notifications when I upload brand new videos. The start of the war actually saw mostly open warfare, with the two sides believing that they could bring destruction to the other with a quick and swift invasion. The French attempted to invade Germany by going through Alsace-Lorraine, and the Germans attempted to invade France with the Schlieffen Plan by going through Belgium. Both sides obviously fail at this, which leads to stagnation on the fronts. Quite literally, the first trenches are where two sides of men are stuck at opposite ends of a field and start digging because they want to get away from the bullets the other side is shooting at them. Now, eventually these first basic ditches did transform into the first basic trenches, and trenches had been used before in warfare, just not to the scale that they were about to be. The early trenches were also a sniper's dream. However, this glaring issue would be solved as the war went on, as more and more work was done at night. Obviously, a big upside of doing everything at night, even though you have to stay up quite late, is you have a much smaller chance of being unalived. If the men weren't busy being picked off by snipers, they were normally busy in the trench writing letters. And this was to counteract the utter boredom that you could face, as well as the freezing cold and the mud that was 3 to 4 feet deep, that's just under and just over 1 metre, threatened to drown a man if he wasn't careful. At this stage in the war, the occasional small-scale armistice did take place. None of these were an armistice in the traditional sense. It was more looking the other way if you saw someone caught in the middle of no man's land, or not taking a pot shot at a helmet you see poking above a trench. On top of this, both armies would normally eat their meals at roughly the same time, which allowed for a daily ceasefire and a daily respite from the war. Patrols would often simply ignore each other, and troops would more than often just shout abuse at each other from the trenches, and yes, they were that close to each other. Now, as summer gives way to autumn and winter, the French asked the British to deliver a brutal blow to the German lines, as they believed that the Germans are settling down and beginning to move troops towards the Eastern Front.
I'm going to do what's called a pro-gamer move.
The French organised 2 attacks, the first of which is around the 17th of December in the Artois area.
You've been Artois!
A few days later, they smashed the German lines at Champagne. Around 250,000 men are sent into no man's land, slamming into the German lines in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate and move back to open warfare. The winter would cause the trenches to flood and, on occasion, collapse, burying young men alive. In the rare moments the soldiers could get some shut-eye, they would often try sleeping on the side of a trench to avoid the boggy, squelchy, muddy floor below. Rations often had to be strung to the ceiling to avoid them going rotten, although putting them on the floor was enough of a risk as it was, because by this point the mud had essentially turned to quicksand. The mud was so thick that sometimes you wouldn't find the body of a man who had slipped and drowned in the mud for hours, or perhaps even days, and even then that's when you trod on their body. It was at this fun time that many soldiers also began suffering from dysentery. At least you can go anywhere and no one's going to notice.
Disgusting!
As dark and gloomy as all of this is, none of this was the biggest enemy of the men in the trenches. It wasn't the collapsing trenches from mudslides in the rain. It wasn't the mud that threatened to drown you if you took a wrong turn and slipped with no one around you. It wasn't the enemy a few yards away, waiting with their machine guns for the whistle to blow and for you to charge. No. It was trench foot and frostbite that ended up sending large swathes of men back from the front lines. Some were actually never able to return to the front lines. Now, obviously, as you can tell, hygiene clearly was a necessity in the trenches, so in an attempt to stay clean, soldiers would take 3 inches of water and put it into their D-type mess tin. They would take 1 inch of that water and use that to shave. The remaining 2.5 inches of water was their shower. And yes, that doesn't go as far as a full shower. The soldiers would take their hands, dip them into the mess tin, and clean the important bits. The neck, the armpits, and the essentials. Weapons needed to be cleaned 3 times a day, and to be honest, this makes sense, because you don't really want to be running at a bunch of angry Germans with machine guns, only for your pew-pew stick not to pew. Another issue faced by the soldiers in the trenches, bearing in mind it's winter, is they couldn't cook any food. This is because the smoke invited artillery fire. So as winter dragged on, when not cleaning their rifles in the freezing cold, they would eat freezing cold food in the freezing cold, while trying to sleep sitting up in the freezing cold. Now, as this sort of live and let live attitude began to develop between the British forces and the Germans, Sir John French orders a series of winter attacks in order to avoid a fledgling friendship with the enemy. He also stated that not a single unofficial armistice would be tolerated. With all these Allied offensives going on, the British Expeditionary Force is prepared for almost none of them. With little to no artillery support, these attacks do not go well, and towards the end of these attacks, the British would only send 2 battalions. These 2 battalions were the Royal Gordon Highlanders and the Royal Scots. These 2 battalions are promptly massacred, with the Royal Highlanders losing 75% of their officers and over half their men. No ground is gained. To top off how awful these attacks were, it took the wounded 3 days to be recovered from no man's land, or, in dire cases, crawl back from no man's land. And that's if you were one of the lucky ones. However, men like Field Marshal Douglas Haig saw these attacks as a useless waste of men's lives, and in his attacks would make use of aerial reconnaissance, ground reconnaissance, and would plan his attacks far more thoroughly. Finally, towards the end of December, the attacks begin to draw to a close. But don't forget, historically, campaign season is spring and summer. You don't campaign in the later part of the years because it's hard to move troops, and because it's hard to win battles. Leading up to Christmas, Pope Benedict XV called for a truce between the 2 sides, although this was largely ignored by the governments of the various nations involved in the war. Yet the mood in the trenches was high-spirited. The Germans especially were getting presents from the Kaiser himself. NCOs would get cigar boxes, and the regular soldier would get pipes with the Crown Prince on them. He was keeping them fighting fit. For British troops, Princess Mary raised a small fund so that the women of the Empire and herself could give them all a gift on Christmas Eve.
It's a poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every December the 25th.
Each soldier received a little brass box with some cigarettes, tobacco, a Christmas card and some sweets. Now, there was actually 2 options for this present, a smoker's version and a non-smoker's version. Now, to be honest, I've quit smoking and I've quit vaping, but if I was stuck in a trench with an angry German man a few yards away just waiting for me to take a dump so that he can blow my skull open, I'm smoking 69 a day. Personal gifts were also allowed on the front. German families sent chocolate, alcohol, and German salami to the soldiers. And to be fair, I do love me some German salami.
Wait, what?
However, the British got a far superior gift. The British families often sent over a Christmas pud. And a dozen carton boxes of cigarettes. However, the greatest gift to the soldiers on the front line that came that Christmas Eve was that the rains that had hounded them all winter finally came to an end. The muddy ground froze over and no man's land was decorated with beautiful snow that at least made some of the bodies a bit less obvious. However, as the snow fell, the gunfire slowed down and everyone settled in for quiet. Which scared the shit out of British High Command, who were convinced the Germans were preparing an attack. To make matters worse, suddenly lights were seen from the German lines. Small jars can be seen up and down the battleground, with little trees accompanying them. These little trees are called Tannenbaum, or Christmas trees to English speakers. It's a little known fact that Christmas trees began as a German tradition. It's one of the many things that link our two cultures. Got to thank Prince Albert for bringing the Christmas trees over though. Watchmen of the Scots Guard are among the first to see these festivities and are bracing for an attack. Instead, they hear the beautiful voices of German carol singers singing Stille Nacht, Hagelnacht. I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but it is the original Austrian version of Silent Night. Down the line, Private Frank Sumter is amongst the first to realise what the Germans are singing, and him and his fellow soldiers decide to carol back. Somewhere else down the line, Lieutenant Sir Edward Hulse decided to rise to the occasion and ordered his men to carol back. This intense battle would rage until the two sides met in a perfect harmony. Christmas greetings were thrown back and forth across the lines, and in some places officers went into no man's land to negotiate a temporary truce. The murmurs of what would happen the next day were beginning to take shape. Marmaduke Wilkington of the Queen's Westminster Rifles remarked that he was only 300 yards away from the Germans when they began carolling together and shouting abuse and shouting season's greetings until a German voice said, "Tomorrow you no shoot, tomorrow we no shoot." Quite a few of the German soldiers had actually worked in England as bar staff, as waiters, or as similar jobs. And so most of them could actually speak English. So when the English shouted something at the Germans were able to shout something back. And this eventually transformed into conversations, which transformed into something the higher-ups of both sides would come to hate. Fraternisation with the enemy. And the British side often shouted, "Waiter! Waiter!" Again, this was because most of the waiters back home were German. Life before cancel culture. Some men, however, felt slightly differently about the situation. One officer saw the lights and the trees and prepared to open fire. Much to his annoyance, his commanding officer ordered him not to shoot unless shot at. Finally, a single gunshot rang out, and the officer took his chance, giving the order to fire. Angered by the death of a man earlier that afternoon, he made sure that every tree and jar was shot down. Occasionally, a brave soul would wander into no man's land holding a newspaper in the hopes of negotiating a truce, and more than a few of these young men were shot down. Upon some sections of the Western Front, the British woke up to see the Germans just strolling around their parapets. In some other places, one or two men began to poke their heads up and walk towards each other's lines. The main and first focus of the Christmas Truce was to be able to bury the dead. In one weird twist of history, there was a service held between British and German soldiers in memoriam for the dead that each side had killed. Mr. Rickner, a German artillery soldier, remembered how on Christmas Day French and German soldiers walked up to the barbed wire fences and exchanged gifts of champagne and cigarette. Why is it always cigarettes? However, this really wasn't commonplace, as the French and Belgian soldiers really wanted absolutely nothing to do with the German soldiers, and this was mainly because their countries were currently being occupied by German soldiers. However, across the French, Belgian and German lines, there is still a stilted silence that takes place. In one sector, the Germans did hold fire for long enough for the French to hold mass, while a soloist from Paris gave a performance. Now, being the largest empire the world has ever seen,
it's so big.
Britain pulled in troops from around the globe, and British troops from India were rather confused by all the Christmas stuff that was going on. But it did remind them of their own holiday of Diwali. And again, I apologise if I have mispronounced that. Unlike the rest of the British forces from across the UK, they actually held their positions until the Germans finally coaxed them out of their positions with cigars and cigarettes. Don't start smoking, kids. However, there were some spoil sports, and in sectors where commanders were particularly aggressive, they were just ordered to open fire. Talking about people who were a bit more fun and a bit less aggressive, Lieutenant Hulse spoke with Lieutenant Thomas of the 15th Westphalians. Thomas gave Hulse a Victoria Cross and a series of letters from an officer who had died in an attack on one of the German trenches. To show his gratitude to his fellow officer, Hulse gave Thomas his silk scarf. To return this show of gratitude, Thomas gave Hulse his brand new leather gloves. Of course, all along the lines, the most famous part of the Christmas Truce was taking place. According to one story, a group of Highlanders challenged a Saxon regiment to a game of football, and this was replicated up and down the front lines. Apparently, during that game, the Germans actually found the Highlanders' kilts flying into the air. Quite funny. I wouldn't, because these men are quite literally shooting at you whilst not wearing any underwear in the freezing cold. Curb your enthusiasm. Now, sadly, there is actually no evidence to support the idea that any football matches were actually played. There is a high chance that footballs were brought out. By who, in what sector, we don't know, but the most they were probably used for is a kickabout. But if there was a football match, I'm fairly certain that I could safely say that the winners of the match were in fact England. As is human nature, some simply took this as a time to take a breather from the enemy, repairing dugouts, taking reconnaissance, and some, who were more of the distrusting persuasion, took hidden weapons into no man's land. Which again, you're in the middle of a war. Understandable. In one section of the German lines, a group of Bavarians actually went to their corporal asking if they could go and meet the British. The young corporal shot down the idea immediately, and to be fair, hopes of a truce were already low, as he had refused to go to the service that the Germans had held the night before. The corporal went as far as to scold his men, screaming at them, "Such a thing should not happen in wartime! Have you no sense of German honour at all?" His men would sit down, disheartened and confused as to why he made a real focus of saying German honour. I guess Corporal Hitler had some very strong opinions about Germany. When all was said and done, however, the men would find a solemn wind blowing over them. Once he entered a trench, a German captain would look to the sky in tears and exclaim, "My God, why can't we have peace? Why can't we go home?" He was answered with a stony silence. However, as word began to reach the papers, many debated whether it happened at all, or whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. The reason this leaked to the papers is many soldiers would write home speaking of the truce, and their families would forward this to the papers. There was a good few soldiers who ended up getting in trouble for this. In fact, to this day, there are people that still debate if the Christmas truce actually happened. Now, sadly, All of the veterans of the Great War are no longer with us, but as I was researching, I did pick a couple of amazing quotes. I was out talking and shaking hands with the very men I was out shooting a few hours before. This was my first sight of them at close quarters. Here they were, the actual practical soldiers of the German army. There was not an atom of hate on either side that day. We just said how bloody it was in that mud, how we hated it all. They said, we are Saxons, you're Anglo-Saxons. Why are we fighting? The Russians can't fight. The French won't fight. You're the only people who do fight. Why are we doing this? He laughed, and shouted at each other for about half an hour in no man's land. We shook hands, wished each other good luck. One fellow said, will you send this off to my girlfriend in Manchester? So I took his letter, franked it, and sent it off when I got back. Many soldiers in no man's land that day would debate whether the war was actually worth it. Many on both sides argued that they were fighting for freedom, and the other side was the oppressor. And I think that gives us the answer right there. The truce ended in various ways at various times across the line. Sometimes the artillery would open fire because they were unaware of any truce. Sometimes the new battalion would come in and open fire on an unsuspecting enemy. Yet I think the most brutal aspect of all of this is one of the most poignant moments in all of human history. Had absolutely no effect on the war. To start with, that first wave of soldiers, the regular army whose job it was to shoot other people during a war, were all shot. So the next wave of people to come in hated the other side. They had lost friends or family, and so they signed up specifically to fight. And that went for every nation. The next year, the British would order a 24-hour artillery barrage while opening fire continuously with machine guns as to drown out any carolling Germans. And to dampen the mood further and to ensure that there wouldn't be another truce, the Battle of Verdun was just before Christmas, with 750,000 casualties. On top of this, artillery fire would become a more constant piece of the war. Sniper fire would become an essential aspect on both sides. And most damning of all, the use of chlorine gas would turn the war from a bloodbath to hell on earth. This also ensured that a large portion of the men who had celebrated the truce were dead. In fact, just 3 months after the truce, a young lieutenant was in no man's land helping a fellow soldier when he was shot and killed. Although not the youngest life in World War I to be taken, Lieutenant Hulst was just 25 when he was killed. The First World War killed 25 million people. When all said and done, for no real reason. It wasn't for the glory of a growing empire, and it wasn't in defence against said growing empire. It was purely because of a system of alliances that was designed to stop such a war, but ended up creating it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. It's going to be a bit of a double flight, that one.